What would you do if an HOA called 911 on you for kayaking on the lake you just bought? They called 911 saying I was trespassing on a community lake, even though I owned it. One bizarre accusation opened a trail of lies. An HOA running an illegal lake empire they thought no one would ever question. But they didn't know that Waterway was federally protected, and sooner or later, the law knocks on the right door. This is what happens when an HOA pushes too far, and federal codes push back. The morning the sheriff's cruisers rolled onto my shoreline, the wind over the water was so still it felt like the whole lake was holding its breath. I was sitting in my old red kayak, the one I'd patched 3 different times with marine epoxy, drifting near the center of the lake I had closed on barely 2 weeks earlier. The water in this corner of Wyoming has a particular stillness, cold, glassy, almost stubborn in the way it refuses to ripple unless the mountains decide to send down a gust. I dipped my paddle once, just enough to keep from turning sideways in the soft current, when a flash of blue and red bled across the surface like a stain. I turned. 3 sheriff's vehicles were parked in a hard line along the gravel access road, their lights bouncing off pine bark and the old wooden fence posts I'd meant to replace. One deputy stood outside his cruiser with a hand resting near his holster, scanning the lake like I was some kind of fugitive floating on stolen water. Another lifted binoculars. The third spoke into his radio, never blinking. And then I saw her. Bethany Reed, HOA president of the Sagewater Bluffs community next door, stood at the edge of the shore with the rigid posture of someone who'd practiced intimidation in front of a mirror. Clipboard in hand, lips pressed tight, hair perfectly sprayed into a style that did not belong anywhere near mud or fresh water. Even from across the lake, I could practically feel the disapproval radiating off her like heat from a sun-baked rock. I kept my voice level. "Morning," I called, because old ranch habits die slowly, and politeness is the last thing you let go of. Bethany didn't answer. She lifted the clipboard like it was some ceremonial weapon and pointed at me. "That man is trespassing on community property," she announced loudly enough for her voice to echo off the hills. The deputy closest to the water cupped his hands around his mouth. "Sir, paddle to shore, now!" Around Bethany, a small crowd of Sagewater residents gathered, several holding their phones high above their heads. I could see the shimmer of their screens reflecting sunlight. Already recording, already anticipating a spectacle, already certain that I was in the wrong. It's strange how quickly humiliation can creep in, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. One moment I was enjoying the smell of pine sap and cold lake water. The next I was a sideshow attraction for people who didn't even know my name. I straightened up in the kayak. "I'm on my property," I shouted back. "This is my lake." Bethany's laugh carried clear across the water, sharp as a crow's call. "Your lake?" "Sir, Sagewater Bluffs has managed this water for years. Please stop embarrassing yourself." A few of the spectators chuckled. Someone zoomed their camera in closer. The deputy lowered his hand from his holster, but didn't relax. The surface of the lake rippled, not from wind, but from the way my pulse thumped against the plastic hull. I'd been a civil water engineer for 15 years before buying this land. Evaluating rivers, repairing small dams, studying rights of way older than state lines. I'd read every page of my deed twice. I knew exactly where my property boundaries were drawn. Yet here I was, being treated like a criminal on a lake legally registered under my name. I paddled slowly toward them, the kayak slicing a thin line through the water. My shadow stretched long under the morning sun, warped by the reflection. When I reached the shallows, the gravel below was so clear I could count the stones. The deputy met me halfway down the bank. "Sir, step out of the kayak." I did. The water soaked my jeans up to the knees as I dragged the kayak ashore, the plastic scraping against wet rocks. Bethany moved in closer, her perfume clashing with the smell of lake mud. "State your name," she ordered. "Remy Cole," I said calmly, "owner of this lake and the surrounding land." Some of the crowd murmured, surprised I didn't look rattled. Bethany didn't flinch. "That's impossible," she snapped. "This lake belongs to the HOA. It has for years. You're trespassing on a community amenity. Sheriff, write the citation." I blinked slowly. A breeze picked up and rustled through the lodgepole pines behind them, sending a whisper through the branches that sounded eerily like the land itself trying to warn me to stay patient. My patience was already wearing thin. "I closed on this property July 3rd, I said. "Deed recorded with the county the same day. This lake is on my parcel, all 47 acres of it." Bethany raised her chin, eyes narrowing into slits. "Show me the deed, then." "I don't carry it in my kayak," I said evenly. A few people laughed, not at me, but at the absurdity of her demand. But she ignored them. Her grip tightened on the clipboard, knuckles whitening. "This is a violation," she insisted. "We've improved this lake, maintained it. We even built docks. You can't just show up and claim ownership because you think you bought some abandoned land." "Ma'am," the deputy interrupted carefully, "if he does own the parcel, then—" She cut him off. "Sheriff, do your job." For a split second, the world seemed to still. The water, the pines, the gravel, all holding still like they were watching the standoff. I looked at the deputy. He looked uncomfortable, torn between protocol and the HOA president breathing fire beside him. "Sir," he said to me, "if you are the owner, we can sort this out. But you need to understand, if the HOA really has legal claim, this could escalate." The phones recording this moment tilted lower, closer to my face. People wanted a reaction, anger, panic, maybe an outburst, something ugly they could post online tonight, but I wasn't giving them that. The sun glinted off the lake behind me, a sharp, clean disk of light that made the water shimmer like polished metal. I felt the weight of the land, the weight of knowing it was mine, anchor me in place. "Deputy," I said slowly, "before you go any further, you might want to ask the HOA a simple question." Bethany folded her arms. "And what question is that?" I turned to her fully. "Do you have any paperwork, any, showing this lake belongs to you?" Silence spread through the crowd like smoke. Bethany's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. A hesitation. Barely visible, but I caught it. The deputy noticed too. "Ma'am," he said to her, "do you?" Her jaw clenched. "We don't need to show him anything. He's the one trespassing." The deputy exhaled slowly. "That's not how property works." A murmur spread through the residence. Arms lowered. Phones stopped recording for a moment. And just like that, a new question replaced the old one. If the HOA really owned the lake, why did they look so uneasy being asked to prove it? I stood there dripping lake water onto the gravel, watching the fear, confusion, and anger mingle across Bethany Reed's face, and it struck me in a sudden, chilling clarity. They weren't calling 911 because they believed I was trespassing. They were calling 911 because they were terrified someone had finally shown up who knew the difference between assumed control and actual ownership. I stared at the line of sheriff cruisers, the flashing lights painting the lake in frantic colors, and realized this wasn't about a kayak. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about power. Fake power being challenged for the first time. And the worst part? I still had no idea how far the HOA was willing to push this illusion to keep control of a lake that wasn't theirs. The sheriff's cruisers finally powered down their lights, leaving the water dimming back to its natural color, a soft blue-gray that reminded me of early mornings on the ranch where I grew up. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and dust from the old access road. The kind of scent that usually steadied my nerves. Not today. Not with the weight of half a dozen phones pointed at me and Bethany Reed looking like she'd just cornered a trespasser instead of its owner. "Sheriff!" Bethany barked. flipping a page on her clipboard with theatrical irritation. As I said, Sagewater Bluffs HOA has maintained, funded, and administered this body of water since 2019. This is the second time we've had to address unauthorized use. Unauthorized, I repeated quietly, almost tasting the bitterness of the word. The deputy nearest me, a younger guy with a sunburned neck and a cautious tone, shifted his stance. Ma'am, we still need to confirm. It's in our bylaws, Bethany insisted, lifting the clipboard like it was scripture. Section 14, Community Water Feature Maintenance and Usage, and we approved the improvements during a board meeting, which I chaired. I stepped closer, boots sinking slightly in the muddy edge of the shoreline. Improvements? I asked. You mean those brand new docks? The floating buoys? The Sagewater Summer Family Jet Ski Saturdays banner hanging on the north end? She didn't seem fazed. If anything, she squared her shoulders as if I'd just proven her point. Exactly. Those amenities don't maintain themselves. The crowd murmured approvingly, encouraged by her certainty. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "He must be new," and someone else muttered, "How does he not know?" I studied Bethany's face as she spoke. She was too confident, too rehearsed. Whatever story she'd built about this lake had been told many times before, and judging by the residents around her, they'd bought into it wholeheartedly. The deputy cleared his throat. Sir, the HOA claims they've been the ones taking care of the lake, managing it, improving it, and, well, using it. Folks say it's always been open to the community. Always? I asked. The deputy glanced at Bethany, then back at me, lowering his voice. Well, at least for a while. For a moment, my irritation cooled into a quieter kind of confusion. I'd only owned the land for a short time, but I'd spent weeks reviewing the parcel maps, water easement records, survey markers, things most people would never look at twice. And nowhere, not once, was there any reference to a community claim or HOA access rights. Yet here this deputy stood, sounding like he believed it could be possible. I took a slow breath. Deputy, with respect, how long is a while? He hesitated. A couple years, maybe. Bethany cut in again, the edges of her voice sharp. 4 years, as stated in last quarter's community report. Sheriff, we really must expedite this. The residents are waiting. A woman behind her stepped forward, a tall brunette wearing a Sagewater sweatshirt, and an expression that made it clear she wasn't a fan of being questioned. My kids learned to swim here, she said. We've had barbecues on the shore every summer. This lake is ours. Ours? I asked softly. She faltered, glancing at Bethany for reassurance before nodding stiffly. Yes, ours. The deputy looked back at me, his confusion deepening. Sir? I mean, you can see why there's a misunderstanding. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let my eyes trace the familiar landmarks, the broken stump near the South Cove, the leaning fence post halfway up the ridge, the old gravel trail leading back toward my cabin. Every piece of this place was something the previous owner had left behind, pieces of a property that had never been touched by an HOA's landscaping crew or their brightly painted rules. But the biggest clue wasn't on land. It was in the water. A fresh wooden dock sat just 20 yards to my left, the kind built with pressure-treated lumber that still carried the golden color of new-cut wood. The bolts were shiny. The rubber bump guards didn't even have scuff marks. And again, I noticed something that had bothered me from the moment I arrived. None of this had existed the day I purchased the land. Bethany saw me staring. Beautiful, isn't it? My husband suggested the upgraded materials. Sagewater pays for quality. Your HOA paid for that, Doc? I asked quietly. Of course, she said, flipping another page. We keep the receipts of all community improvements. I'd love to see those receipts. Her smile tightened. They're not for public review. Good, I replied, stepping closer. Because I'm not the public. I'm the owner. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, some confused, some annoyed, some suddenly less sure than before. Bethany didn't blink. Sheriff, again, we have bylaws, we have minutes, we have precedent. I met her eyes. Do you have deeds? She opened her mouth, then closed it. The pause was brief, less than a heartbeat, but everyone saw it. For the first time, the residents recording this mess lowered their phones slightly. The deputy beside me tapped his notebook. Ma'am, do you have anything? A document, a permit, something from the county, state? Anything showing the HOA owns this lake? She inhaled sharply, her posture tightening. This is ridiculous. The community invested. That's not ownership, I said. And you, she snapped, are disrupting Sagewater's right to maintain community safety. We have small children who swim here, teenagers who kayak. Liability alone. Liability? I repeated, nodding slowly. Yes, that's exactly what I've been thinking about. The deputy's eyes flickered. Sir, what do you mean? I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I looked at the dock again. The perfect angles, the new lumber, the telltale signs of recent construction. Something about the design tugged at the corner of my memory. I'd seen similar structures during my engineering years, ones that required approvals, environmental impact assessments, shoreline protection reviews. But those were federal guidelines, not county ones. The kind that came with fines in the tens of thousands. The kind regular HOAs didn't touch. Sheriff, I said quietly, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. He raised his eyebrows. What's that? I pointed at the dock. Did the HOA ever get permits for any of this? Bethany's head snapped toward me. That's enough. But it wasn't enough. Not for me. Not for the deputy. Not for the residents, who suddenly looked uneasy. The deputy shifted. That's a fair question, ma'am. The clipboard trembled slightly in Bethany's hand. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, sending ripples across the lake as if the water itself was responding to what hung unspoken in the air. And in that wind, I finally felt it. The HOA didn't just assume ownership. They were terrified of proving it. I took a step back from the crowd, my boots pressing deep into the mud, and a strange calm washed through me. The kind of calm that came right before a storm breaks. Because if there was one thing my years in water engineering had taught me, it was this. Any structure built on protected waters had to follow the law, even if the people building it had no idea those laws existed. And judging by the way Bethany's expression flickered, just for a second, she had absolutely no idea what kind of laws were about to come crashing down on her lake fantasy. I didn't argue. Not one more word. Sometimes the quickest way to expose a lie is to stop pushing against it and let it collapse under its own weight. So I stepped back, lifted the kayak by its faded handle, and began dragging it toward the trail that led up to my cabin. The gravel crunched beneath the hull. The water dripping from the kayak made a thin trail along the dirt, sparkling in the high Wyoming sunlight like a breadcrumb path back to truth. Behind me, voices erupted. That's right, walk away! He knows he's in trouble. HOA warned him. Their certainty rolled off me like mist. For a long time, I'd learned how to keep my voice steady, my breathing level, my face unreadable. Years spent evaluating river flow and dam pressure taught me patience, not because I wanted to wait, but because I had no choice. Water did not care about my frustration. Paperwork did not move faster when I yelled. So I didn't yell now. I let them think I was beaten. At the top of the path, the shade from the old lodgepole pines covered the entrance to my property. My cabin sat another 100 yards beyond that. A sturdy, single-story frame built of rough-cut timber weathered by 100 mountain storms. My truck, a dusty blue F-150, with a cracked side mirror, waited quietly beside the split-rail fence. The sign the previous owner left, "Coal property, no trespassing," hung crooked, one nail loose. I set the kayak down and wiped the lake water from my hands. My palms smelled like pine resin and cold minerals, a scent that had always grounded me. But today it felt sharper, like a reminder of everything I stood to lose if I handled this wrong. Inside the cabin, the wood creaked the way only old cabins do, like it was settling back into itself. Sunlight streamed through the windows in long, dusty beams that illuminated the large oak table I'd repurposed as my maps and documents station. Rolled survey papers sat beside stacks of old deeds, some dating back to the 1930s. A half-empty mug of black coffee had gone cold hours ago, the surface forming a thin film that mirrored my mood. I dropped into the chair and pulled the deed from the top of the stack. The paper was stiff, its edges yellowed, not from age but from being printed on archival-grade stock by the county. I'd requested that upgrade on purpose. When you own water, you guard every grain of proof. The deed listed the parcel number, the acreage, the boundaries marked by coordinates and natural landmarks. Clear lines, clear ownership, no ambiguity. But one detail kept tugging at me. The lake was its own sub-designation inside the larger parcel, labeled simply Coal Lake. Not Sagewater Bluffs, not Community Lake, Coal Lake. My eyes drifted to the old government survey maps I'd tacked to a corkboard. Lines drawn by men long gone, surveyors who'd ridden horses through these hills with nothing but compasses, chains, and stubbornness. I traced a finger along a faded blue line running from the north ridge down toward the lake. It wasn't a river, not a creek either. It was labeled Historic Log Flume Route, 1890s. A chill crawled down the back of my neck. It wasn't just land. It wasn't just water. There was history here. History that the HOA didn't know existed, and that history had rules. But I wasn't ready to jump ahead. Not yet. First, I needed confirmation from someone who didn't rely on community rumors or clipboard fantasies. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her name. Sarah Mitchell, Water and Land Use Attorney. One of the sharpest in Wyoming. One of the only people who'd ever beaten a federal easement dispute in court. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Remy? I haven't heard from you since the sale closed. How's the new property treating you? I exhaled slowly. That depends. Does having 3 sheriff's cruisers surround me on my own lake count as normal HOA behavior in your world? Silence. Then, tell me everything. I paced the cabin as I relayed the events. The shouting, the phones recording, Bethany's declarations, the docs, the supposed management claims, every detail. Sarah didn't interrupt. Not once. When I finished, I could almost hear her leaning back in her office chair. That lake, she said carefully, is more complicated than you think. I know, I replied, glancing at the old maps. I think the HOA has been building structures without any permits, and if this route, this old flume line, means what I think it does, it might not be just county or state jurisdiction, she finished. It might be federal. Her voice lowered. Remy, do you still have the historical topography maps the seller gave you? I looked at the corkboard, right in front of me. And any evidence the HOA built on the shoreline? Several docks, 2 sets of buoy lines, and what looks like a jet ski rental stand. Rental? Sarah repeated sharply. They're making money off the lake? Looks that way, she inhaled. Then you need to document everything. Every board, every rope, every piece of signage. I already started, I said. Good. Because if this is what I think it is, Sagewater Bluffs might be in a lot worse trouble than trespassing. I sat back down at the oak table. What am I dealing with here, Sarah? She paused. Remy, You might be sitting on a federal waterway designation, and if that's true, then any structure they built, even a wooden dock, would be illegal without authorization from the Army Corps of Engineers. I stared at the map again. The old blue line, the sub-designation, the deeds. Can you verify it? I asked quietly. I can, she said. Send me photos of everything. I'll cross-check it against the Federal Waterway Registry and old timber transport routes. The weight in my chest eased, not because the problem was smaller, but because finally I wasn't carrying it alone. Sarah, I asked, what happens if the HOA is operating illegally on federal water? Her answer was immediate. Then they've been playing with fire, and the flame just found oxygen. After we hung up, I stood at the window overlooking the lake. Bethany and her group had dispersed, though 2 residents lingered near one of the new docks, still animatedly discussing something. The water reflected the mountains like a mirror, but the reflection felt off, disturbed by invisible lines the HOA had crossed long before I arrived. The wind picked up again, bending the tall grass along the shoreline. A loose sheet of paper on the table fluttered, then slid off, landing near my boots. I picked it up. It was the inspection report from the previous owner, buried in the documents the estate had provided. The last page included a short handwritten note. Found old markers on East Shore. Possible federal claim. Needs research. The HOA had never mentioned any of this, but someone before me had known, and now I knew too. The illusion Bethany relied on was already cracking. Still, a strange stillness settled over the room, like the cabin itself was waiting for my next move. I closed the deed folder, grabbed my camera, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The sky had shifted to a deeper blue, the sun sliding lower. Shadows stretched long across the dirt trail. As I walked toward the lake, the boards of the porch creaked under my boots. The air smelled like willow bark and damp stone. The breeze carried faint laughter from the Sagewater side, a reminder that while they celebrated their supposed authority, I was about to dismantle its foundation piece by piece. Let them think they'd won. Let them enjoy their moment. Because the next time I walked down to that lakeshore, I wouldn't be alone. I'd have the truth and the law. And if there was one thing HOA presidents hated more than losing control, it was facing someone who knew exactly where their authority ended, especially when that authority ended at the water's edge. By the time dusk settled over the ridge, the lake had transformed from the bright glare of afternoon into a muted sheet of silver blue, the kind of color that made the mountains look like they'd been painted in fading charcoal. I stood on the porch, hands tucked into the back pockets of my jeans, listening to the faint lapping of water against the shore and the distant muffled hum of generators coming from Sagewater's side. They were still down there, Bethany's loyalists, gathered around their new docks, pretending nothing had happened, pretending they still owned the narrative. Let them. I stepped back into the cabin, grabbed the folder of old survey files, and spread everything across the oak table again. The thin lamplight cast amber shadows over the maps, highlighting creases worn by decades of hands before mine. The oldest map, dated 1889, was the one that mattered most. Thick parchment, edges curling like the bark of a dying pine. A series of blue ink lines carved through the terrain with meticulous precision. Most people would see them as nothing more than scribbles. But Sarah? Sarah would see what I saw. I snapped photos from different angles, making sure the old markers on the eastern shoreline were visible. After the last photo, I added pictures of the newer structures. The jet ski rack, the bright blue buoys arranged in a neat semicircle, the fresh lumber of the dock. If I tilted the lens just right, you could see the manufacturer's stamp still fresh on the underside. Then I texted the entire batch to Sarah. 3 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Sarah, call me. I dialed immediately. "Tell me I'm overreacting," I said. "You're not," she answered without hesitation. "Remy, that lake of yours isn't just a lake. It's part of a historical water transport system." I pressed a palm against the table, leaning in. "You're talking about the flume line." "Yes. That route wasn't just for moving logs. It was designated under the Federal Navigability Doctrine." I could hear papers shuffling on her end. "Meaning your lake was, and still is, listed as a protected navigable waterway." My breath stalled. Not in fear, but in realization. Protected navigable waterways weren't owned by HOAs. They weren't regulated by counties. They weren't even governed by regular state water boards. They were under federal jurisdiction. "Sarah," I said slowly, "the docks, the buoys, the rental signs, all of that would need federal approval," she finished. "Permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, environmental review, impact assessments. You can't build anything on or over those waters without clearance." I let the silence stretch long enough to hear the distant call of an owl echo through the pines. "And the HOA?" I finally asked. "They don't have anything on file," she said. "Not with the state, not with the county, and definitely not with federal agencies." I rubbed a thumb across the map, tracing the faded blue line like it was an old scar. "Then those docks—" "Illegal," she said. "Every nail, every board, every float." I leaned back, the wooden chair groaning beneath me. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing the tops of the grasses into a rhythmic sway. The night air felt charged, as if the land itself sensed a shift. "And Remy?" Sarah added. "Yeah? You told me earlier they're charging fees for lessons and rentals?" "They are. Summer passes, jet skis, everything." She let out a low whistle. "Then they're running unauthorized commercial operations on federal water. That carries fines. Big ones." "How big?" "6 figures big." For a moment I didn't speak. Not because the number shocked me, but because everything suddenly made sense. The desperation in Bethany's voice, the urgency in her demands, the way she clung to her clipboard like a life raft. The HOA hadn't just overstepped. They'd built their entire identity on an illusion, and that illusion was about to burst. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I'm going back to the shoreline. Be careful. If they think you're trying to interfere, they might escalate." I chuckled. "They already escalated. They called 911. "Then they'll go further," she warned. "Desperate HOA presidents make the worst decisions." I grabbed my jacket, stepped outside, and walked the trail back toward the water. The moon had risen, full and bright, casting a silver sheen across Coal Lake. The shadows of the pines stretched long and thin, like dark fingers reaching toward the water's edge. When I reached the shoreline, everything was quiet except for the soft slap of waves brushing the gravel. The dock stood there, new, fresh, defiant, its posts sinking into sovereign federal water as if staking a claim to a kingdom that had never belonged to them. I knelt and ran a hand along the beam. The wood was still smooth, barely weathered. I spotted the manufacturer's date. 2 months ago. 2 months. Not years, as Bethany had claimed. Not even close. The HOA hadn't managed the lake. They'd taken it, quickly, quietly, and without permission. I reached for my camera and began filming every detail. The nail pattern, the spacing of the slats, the exact distance from the shoreline. My breath steamed in the cool air as I narrated quietly, not for drama, but for documentation, for truth. By the time I finished, the moon had risen higher, spilling a wide path of white light shone across the lake's surface. I sat on a weathered log and stared out across the water, letting the cold night air seep into my lungs. This lake had been misused, misclaimed, reshaped by people with no respect for the roots beneath it. But the law remembered. The water remembered. And now I did too. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. Sarah, I'll start drafting a formal inquiry salary to the Army Corps in the morning. Document everything. Don't engage with them directly unless you have to. I typed back a short reply, then slipped the phone into my pocket. The night settled around me, quiet and steady, as if the land itself had paused to listen. The HOA thought they understood control. They thought they could rewrite boundary lines with wood planks and community newsletters. They thought this lake was nothing more than a decorative pond for summer parties. But this place had a memory older than any HOA. And soon they were going to learn the difference between claiming something and actually having the right to own it. The next morning broke colder than usual for midsummer in Wyoming. A thin layer of fog drifted low across the lake, rolling in slow, deliberate ribbons that hugged the surface like breath against glass. From my cabin porch, I watched the mist shift and reveal shapes: shoreline, old pines, the faint silhouette of the illegally built dock, each appearing and disappearing like a warning whispered by the land itself. I sipped coffee from a chipped enamel mug, warming my hands as the sun fought its way up over the ridge. The world was quiet, broken only by the occasional splash of a trout breaching the still surface. Then the engines started. Not trucks, not cars. Boats. Multiple. The growl of tuned engines echoed off the valley walls, tearing through the calm morning air. I lowered the mug and stepped toward the edge of the porch, heart tightening. Through the thinning fog, bright shapes emerged. A pair of jet skis, their colors garish against the muted gray of the lake, followed by a pontoon boat overloaded with equipment. I shook my head slowly. They weren't backing down. They were expanding. I walked down the dirt path toward the water, boots kicking up dust mixed with morning dew. As I approached the shoreline, the fog finally broke, giving me a full view of the scene on Sagewater's side. A construction crew, 5 men in matching vests, were unloading lumber from the pontoon boat and carrying boards to the new dock. Brightly colored pieces of PVC piping lay scattered in the grass like bones of some synthetic animal. A banner reading, "Sagewater Summer Weekend Launch, Coming Soon," hung between 2 pine trees, flapping in the breeze. My jaw tightened. They hadn't paused operations. They hadn't waited for clarity. They doubled down as if racing against an invisible clock, as if they knew time wasn't on their side. Then Bethany appeared, dressed in a turquoise athletic jacket, sunglasses perched high on her head. She strode down the shoreline with the confidence of someone who believed the world would bend for her. She pointed at the water, shouting instructions I couldn't hear, and the workers adjusted their pace. I pulled my phone from my pocket and recorded everything. Each new board, each hammer strike, each piece of rented equipment hauled illegally across the federal waterway. Then I noticed someone else, a man I didn't recognize standing beside Bethany. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a clean button-down that didn't match the mud under his boots. His arms gestured widely, explaining something about load capacity, angles, maybe stability. He wasn't a handyman. He was a builder, a developer. And sure enough, when he turned, I saw the embroidered logo on his vest. Mercer Development Group. I felt the name hit me like cold water running down my back. Jake Mercer. I'd heard of him. Everyone in the region had. A developer notorious for towing the line between creative building and ask forgiveness, not permission. Several news pieces over the years had mentioned code violations, rushed projects, odd permit approvals. Nothing had stuck. Until now. Standing beside Bethany like a silent partner in crime, he looked out across the lake with a proprietary gaze. His expression said, "I built this. I control this." But he hadn't built it. He'd taken it. A loud laugh caught my attention. A group of Sagewater residents had gathered near the water, watching the construction like it was a community event. Two teenage boys zipped around on jet skis, sending arcs of spray into the air. A man waved a laminated brochure for seasonal lake passes, showing photos of families tubing, water skiing, barbecuing on pontoon decks. But every wave they created, every wake they left behind, rippled across my lake, choking my shoreline, eroding my embankments, violating federal law. I took several photos, zooming in on Mercer's face, Bethany's clipboard, the expanded dock, the jet skis, even the license plates on the trucks parked illegally near the access point. Then I heard footsteps behind me. "Busy morning down there?" I turned to see Sheriff Marcus Hale approaching. Tall, calm, hat pulled low, denim jacket dusted with road grit. He stopped beside me, hands resting on his belt, eyes scanning the activity across the water. "I'd say so," I muttered. He exhaled, long and slow. "Got a few calls this morning. Some residents said you were interfering with community property." I let out a short breath of disbelief. "I'm standing on my land, Sheriff." He nodded. "I know. Doesn't stop people from calling." The sheriff studied the jet skis carving white lines through the fog. "Remy, I don't know exactly what you're looking at here, but this looks bigger than a neighborhood squabble." "It is," I said. "A lot bigger." He gave me a sideways glance. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" I considered my words carefully. I had the deed. I had the maps. I had Sarah's preliminary findings. But until the federal verification came through, dropping legal jargon with a sheriff wasn't the right move. Still, I could hint. "Let's just say," I said, choosing my tone, "some people built things on water they shouldn't have." Marcus nodded once. "That tracks. When I drove by last night, I didn't recall seeing all those docks before." He watched Mercer for a long moment. "You see that man there? That's Jake Mercer. He's been on my radar before." "Then you know what he's capable of." The sheriff gave a slow, thoughtful hum. "I know he moves fast, builds fast, and sometimes pretends paperwork magically appears." We stood in silence, both staring across the lake. The workers hammered away, the rhythmic thud-thud echoing across the open water like a challenge. "Remy," Marcus said finally, voice low, "you need to tread careful. Folks like Bethany and folks like Mercer, they don't back down easy." "That's fine," I said. "Neither do I." He huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." Marcus tipped his hat and turned to leave, but he paused halfway up the trail. "Document everything," he said without looking back. "This is going to get messy before it gets clear." I watched him disappear into the pines, his boots crunching over dry needles. When he was gone, I focused again on the lake. A worker drilled a hole into a support beam. Another carried buckets of bolts. A third attached a bright orange ladder to the end of the dock. They were transforming the shoreline into a full-blown recreational hub, as if the water were just a backdrop for their summer fantasies and not the centerpiece of a century-old federal designation. I lifted my camera again, zoomed in, captured every spark, every tool, every boat, every scrap of proof, because the HOA had just escalated their claim into a full-scale construction project. And while they thought they were building a playground, what they were really building was a record of violations tall enough to crush the entire Sagewater Bluffs HOA from the inside out. The wind skimmed across the lake, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of wet lumber and gasoline toward me. Let them build. Let them celebrate. Let them believe the lake was theirs. Because with every board they added, every post they drove, every dollar they spent expanding their little empire, they were only digging themselves deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of. Not once the law caught up to them. I woke before sunrise the next day, long before the first hint of color touched the horizon. The lake outside my cabin window sat dark and quiet, like a sheet of smoked glass waiting to reflect a world that wasn't awake yet. The cold inside the cabin bit at my skin as I slipped on my boots, but the chill helped sharpen my mind. I needed clarity, real clarity, not speculation, not hunches, not the pieces Sarah and I were stitching together in the dark. I needed the one thread that would pull everything apart. A permit. If the HOA truly believed they had any legal ground, they would have filed something, anything, to justify building those docks. Even fake confidence usually left a paper trail. I grabbed my keys, bundled up, and stepped outside. The morning smelled like damp cedar and old earth. My truck's engine sputtered, then settled into a familiar rumble as I headed toward the county records office. The roads were mostly empty, the rising sun spreading a faint apricot glow along the distant ridges. Dust kicked up behind me as I drove, drifting in the rearview mirror like a ghostly wake. No music played, no radio. No, just silence and the hum of an old truck climbing through winding rural roads. When I reached the small brick building that housed both zoning and county records, the parking lot was still empty. The receptionist, an older woman with silver hair and the no-nonsense tone of someone who'd been doing this job for decades, looked up over her glasses. "Morning, Remy. Haven't seen you since your deed filing." "Morning, Linda. I'm hoping you can help me with something simple." She smiled faintly. Simple is relative in this place. I leaned on the counter. "I need access to any permits or filings related to structures on Coal Lake. Anything from Sagewater Bluffs HOA for docks, buoys, shoreline improvements, past few years." Her brows lifted. "That lake? You know it?" She nodded gently. "Been a headache ever since Sagewater expanded their neighborhood to the ridgeline. They've tried filing things here and there, never quite correctly." "Meaning?" "They'd submit half-filled forms, leave out coordinates, forget environmental assessments. Sometimes they'd file something with no fees attached." She adjusted her glasses. "Nothing that ever got approved." I let that settle. "But is there a record? Even of the rejected ones?" She tapped her keyboard with the slow precision of someone who refused to let a machine rush her. After a minute, she paused. "Well, looky here. They filed a construction permit 3 months ago." 3 months? I repeated. "Not years, like Bethany keeps claiming." 3 months, she confirmed. And it wasn't even filed by the HOA officially. The applicant was listed as... She squinted at the screen. Mercer Development Group. My pulse tightened. "Jake Mercer," I said softly. Linda nodded. "Yes, name's right here." The room felt suddenly smaller. "What did the permit request?" I asked. She clicked again. "Temporary recreational structures, floating dock, jet ski platforms, advertising signage." "Was it approved?" She gave a dry laugh. "Denied. Completely denied. No environmental review, missing site coordinates, no state waterway clearance, no federal assessment. Didn't even meet the minimum documentation requirements." I swallowed. "But they built it anyway." Her face softened with sympathy. "Seems that way." "Can I get a copy of the denied permit?" "You can get 5, she said, printing a stack. "Make sure you keep these dry. That lake air curls the pages." I thanked her and stepped outside with the papers warm from the printer. The wind lifted the edges as I slid into my truck, spreading the scent of ink and legal futility through the cab. I read through every line before I even turned the key, and 3 pages in, it hit me. Beyond the missing environmental impact statements, beyond the lack of federal clearance, beyond the blatant disregard for navigability laws, one detail stood out like a single rotten plank on a brand new dock. Mercer had listed the location under a false designation: Sagewater Community Pond, Parcel 14B. My heart hammered once, hard. There was no Parcel 14B. There had never been one. They'd made it up, fabricated property identification, filed it with the county, and built on water they didn't own. I gripped the stack of papers tighter, my breath coming in visible clouds inside the cold cab. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. They knew they didn't own the lake. They knew the structures weren't allowed. They knew federal codes stood in the way. And the permit, the one they hoped would rubber stamp their control, contained the name that tied the whole scheme together. Jake Mercer. A man who'd built an entire career by bulldozing legal lines and smoothing the aftermath with charm and manipulation. But this time, he hadn't counted on the lake. He hadn't counted on federal designation. And he sure as hell hadn't counted on me, someone who understood the difference between surface-level authority and rooted legal truth. I started the truck and headed back toward the lake, dust swirling behind me like smoke from a fuse that had just been lit. By the time I reached the ridge overlooking my property, the dock below had grown. A new section stretched out over the water, supported by gleaming metal brackets. Workers moved lumber like ants building a mound, without understanding the storm rolling toward them. I grabbed my camera and scanned the shoreline from above, zooming in on fresh graffiti-style markings they'd placed to guide further construction. Lines, symbols, measurements, all of them based on a permit that had never been approved. All of them tied to Mercer. All of them illegal. A gust of wind blew against my face, carrying the scent of cut wood and lake water. I tasted something metallic on my tongue. Anticipation, anger, and a quiet certainty. The tide had shifted. Mercer had just handed me the one thing the HOA couldn't outrun. Proof they knew exactly what they were doing. I lowered the camera, steadying my breath as the sunlight broke fully across the lake, turning the water a brilliant, deceptive gold. Let Bethany hide behind her clipboard. Let Mercer pretend he owned the shoreline. Let the residents film and gossip and play pretend. Because now I had the document that broke their illusion. And when the law came knocking, it wouldn't be knocking on my door. It would be knocking on theirs. The sun was sliding low behind the pines when I parked outside the Sagewater Community Hall, an oversized ranch-style building with beige siding and a flagpole that hadn't flown a flag in years. The HOA liked symbols more than upkeep. Tonight, those symbols were about to collapse. Residents packed the gravel lot. Trucks and SUVs jammed between freshly painted HOA parking-only signs. Folks were walking in groups toward the double doors, murmuring. Their faces carried a mix of confusion, irritation, and something tight beneath the surface. Fear that their weekend playground wasn't as secure as Bethany had promised. I stepped out of my truck with the manila folder tucked under my arm. The denied permit, the fake parcel number, screenshots, photos, every piece of evidence they never expected someone like me to gather. Sarah Mitchell's Subaru pulled up just as I closed my door. She stepped out wearing jeans, boots, and a gray blazer that made her look like a lawyer who'd rather be anywhere but an HOA meeting. Sheriff Marcus Hale arrived moments later, his cruiser crunching over gravel, lights off, but presence unmistakable. "You ready?" Sarah asked, straightening her collar. "As ready as the lake is." Marcus crossed his arms. "Just keep it civil. Folks get twitchy when money and property mix. And Bethany, well, she's been riling people up all day." Inside, the room buzzed like a hive kicked awake. Folding chairs formed sloppy rows. A long table up front held pitchers of water, stacks of documents, and a tiny wooden gavel Bethany probably used more than her actual authority. She spotted me instantly. "Mr. Cole," she said, raising her chin. "This is a meeting for residents." "I own the lake," I replied, voice calm. "And that's what you'll be discussing. That makes me a stakeholder." Gasps spread through the crowd. Phones lifted. The theater Bethany had hoped for, me embarrassed, her triumphant, was already slipping. She cleared her throat and slammed the gavel harder than necessary. Order, we will begin. But she didn't get the start she wanted. Before she could get 3 words out, an elderly man near the front row stood up. White hair, weathered hands. The kind of face that belonged to someone who'd lived in Wyoming long before Sagewater's developer broke ground. "Bethany," he said, "why's my maintenance fee paying for boats I never approved?" Murmurs rose again. Bethany forced a smile. "Walter, please," another voice cut in. "And why'd you say we own the lake when the county says otherwise?" Then another. "What's this I hear about fines coming our way?" Bethany banged the gavel. "Everyone sit down, we're not discussing rumors. We're discussing Mr. Cole's attempt to interfere with our community's operations." I set my folder on the table. "Your operations?" I asked. "Or Mercer's?" Silence spread like a spill on a dry floor. Jake Mercer, slick hair, fancy boots, the kind of grin that belonged on a billboard, sat 3 seats down on the board. He stiffened, pretending he didn't hear. Sarah stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm Mr. Cole's attorney. If the board is willing, we'd like to present some information that affects your liability as residents." The room shifted. People leaned forward. No one trusted the HOA enough to shut down an attorney. Bethany's voice wavered. "This is out of order." Marcus spoke up, slow and steady. "Doesn't feel out of order to me, Bethany. Folks deserve clarity." Bethany's nostrils flared. She sat. I opened the folder and slid out the denied permit. 3 months ago, I said, rotating the document so the first row could see, Mercer Development filed this permit to build docks on what they labeled Sagewater Community Pond, Parcel 14B. I pointed to the fake parcel number. Problem is, Parcel 14B doesn't exist. Whispers burst like popcorn. People craned their necks to see. I continued. Not only was this permit denied for missing environmental reviews, but it was filed on a made-up location. And yet, I gestured toward the lake outside the window. Your HOA built everything listed here anyway. A woman clutching a toddler gasped. "You mean the playground by the water? The docks? All of it, Sarah confirmed. Unpermitted, illegal. And because the lake is federally designated, the penalties don't fall on Mr. Cole. They fall on the builders and anyone who operated or profited from it." Jake shot to his feet. "That's fear-mongering. Those structures are community improvements." Marcus raised a hand. "Sit down, Jake. Let the man finish." Jake sat, roughly, and his jaw worked overtime. I pulled out a second paper, a scanned federal map. The entire room leaned in. "This lake," I said quietly, "is not a pond. It's a protected waterway from the 1800s, used for timber transport. That designation never expired. And your docks are built straight across a federally recognized channel." Walter, the older man, stared at the map. "My daddy told me stories about log drives here. Said they floated timber from the ridge to the old mill." Sarah nodded. "Yes. And because of that, the waterway has federal oversight, meaning the HOA has been operating a commercial structure on federal water without permission." Every person in the room seemed to inhale at once. Bethany sprang up. "This is absurd. We've been maintaining that lake for years. Everyone here knows it." A middle-aged woman lifted her phone, shaking it angrily. "Bethany, I've been paying $120 a month for lake maintenance, but you never told us we didn't own it." Another man added, "And where did that money go, Bethany? Because Mercer's jet skis sure look new." Jake slammed his palm on the table. "This is a coordinated attack." I calmly pulled one last piece of evidence from the folder, a screenshot of Mercer's public business listing, complete with his jet ski rental fees. "Tell me, Jake," I said, voice steady, "who's pocketing the money? Because it sure isn't the residents." The room erupted, voices sharp, angry, rising in a storm. Chairs scraped, people stood, phones recorded every second. Bethany tried to shout for order, but not even her gavel could cut through the noise now. Then, cutting through the chaos, a voice cracked the room open. It belonged to an older woman in the third row, Margaret, a long-term homeowner with a quiet dignity. "I move," she said, clear as a church bell, "that we suspend Bethany Reed as HOA president effective immediately pending investigation." Another voice, "Second." The roar that followed shook the walls. Bethany's face went pale. She looked at Jake, who refused to meet her eyes. Her empire was cracking. Her certainty was gone. And the lake, the real owner of the truth, was finally speaking through every person who'd been lied to. I didn't have to say another word. The tide had turned, and this time, it was turning against them. But tides don't crash all at once. Sometimes they pull back first, quiet, eerie, careful, right before the biggest wave hits. That's how the days after the HOA meeting felt. The next morning, Sagewater looked like a suddenly abandoned movie set. No kids splashing on the shore. No jet skis tearing across the lake. No HOA board members marching around with clipboards. Even the usual dog walkers kept to the inner trails, glancing over their shoulders like the trees might be listening. Bethany's blue Tahoe didn't move from her driveway. Jake Mercer's trucks weren't parked near the docks. And nobody, absolutely nobody, mentioned lake fees, access badges, or HOA improvement plans. Silence had weight. It settled over the water like low fog. I woke early, brewed a pot of strong coffee inside my cedar cabin, and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp with that Wyoming chill that likes to sneak under your collar, whether you invited it or not. The lake was glass. No wakes, no engines, no echoes. Just still water holding its breath. Sarah called as I leaned against the railing. "You feel that?" she asked. "Feel what?" She exhaled sharply. "The quiet. It's too quiet." That meeting shook them hard. I watched a breeze ripple across the surface of the lake. "They're planning something." "They're panicking," she corrected. "And that's worse. Panicked people hide things, destroy things, move things." She wasn't wrong. By noon, I noticed fresh tire tracks near the trail that led down to the docks. Deep ruts cutting through the dirt, leading straight to the waterline. Someone had been there early, before sunrise. Someone in a hurry. I grabbed my camera and followed the tracks down the hill. Pieces of wood planks floated along the shoreline. A bolt sheared clean off. A rope with a frayed end. A discarded pair of work gloves half buried in the mud. They'd started pulling apart the docks, and they'd done it in the dark. I crouched and photographed everything. Angles, timestamps, the shadows from the pines, the shape of each discarded piece. Evidence didn't have to shout to be powerful. Sometimes it simply had to exist. Behind me, branches cracked. I stood slowly and turned. Sheriff Marcus Hale walked out from the tree line, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. "You see this?" I asked. "Whole county's talking," he replied. "Folks saw trucks rolling through at strange hours. Someone's trying to cover their tracks before the feds come in." His voice was low, controlled. Experience taught him that sudden movements make guilty people nervous. "I've been a sheriff a long time, Remy," he said, staring at the water. "When people think trouble's coming, they scatter, but they always leave footprints. This," he nudged a waterlogged board with his boot. "This is one big footprint." We stood there in the soft rumble of the wind, watching the lake reflect back a sky so blue it felt like a lie. "Sarah submitted everything this morning," I said. "The map, the denied permit, the photos, the rental listings, all of it." Marcus nodded. "Army Corps doesn't take kindly to folks messing with their water, especially protected water." He turned toward the path, but stopped halfway. "Prepare yourself," he said, voice quiet. "When they show up, it won't be gentle." He left me with that thought. That evening, the silence grew thicker. Even the birds seemed unsure if they should call out. I sat at my kitchen table with the porch door open, letting the faint sound of the lake drift in. My laptop glowed with scanned documents. Land deeds, water rights rulings, federal designations from the 1800s. Most people filed paperwork to protect themselves. Tonight, that paperwork felt like armor. A soft chime broke the quiet. A message from Sarah. "They're stalling. I can feel it. Be ready." I typed back, "Already am." But even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Just after midnight, a faint rumble echoed across the water, low, distant, mechanical. I stepped outside barefoot, the wooden porch cool under my feet, and looked toward the opposite shore. Headlights bobbed through the trees. ATVs. 3 of them. They rolled down toward what was left of the docks, engines cutting off one by one. There were no jet skis hitched behind them tonight. Only shapes, silhouettes, moving in the dark. Removing evidence. I lifted my camera and zoomed. Men in hoodies. Work lights set low to keep from drawing attention. Hands yanking up boards, loading them into trailers. Whispers carried faintly over the lake. The panic had begun in earnest. I hit record. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying their voices sharper across the water. Bethany said, "Get it gone before morning. Federal fines. Mercer's losing it. Just take the damn rails." I kept filming. Another board snapped. A flashlight flickered. A curse echoed. Then, in the middle of all that frantic movement, one of them stepped too far onto the dock. It lurched under his weight, old nails popping. He staggered and grabbed another man's arm, barely keeping himself from falling in. He froze. Because he saw me, across the lake, camera raised, recording everything. They didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't wave fists. They simply scrambled, an eruption of movement, loading what they could, abandoning what they couldn't, tires spinning in the mud as they tore back up the hill like ghosts chased by something bigger than themselves. By the time the last engine faded into the trees, the lake was still again. The only sound was the water lapping softly against half-floating boards. I lowered the camera. Their silence wasn't an accident. It was fear. Fear of the law. Fear of consequences. Fear of a truth they'd built their little kingdom, hoping no one would find. And now that truth was staring at them from every angle. It wasn't just the meeting that turned the tide. It was the silence afterward. The kind that comes when people realize they're standing on a cliff, and the ground beneath them has already given way. I looked out over the lake, moonlight sliding across its surface like a blade of silver. The Army Corps would see all of this. Every broken plank, every rushed removal, every desperate attempt to erase what they'd done. The silence wasn't protection. It was confession. And soon enough, the people who'd created it would have to answer for every inch of it. The morning the federal trucks arrived, the lake wasn't calm, it was expectant. A stillness that hummed under the surface, like the water itself knew justice was finally walking down the dirt road. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee warming my hands when the first convoy rounded the curve. 2 white Army Corps of Engineers vehicles, a county environmental inspection truck, and, bringing up the rear, a black SUV with plates I'd only ever seen on state-level investigators. The convoy moved slowly, deliberately, as though they were driving into a crime scene, not a quiet Wyoming lake. In a way, they were. Sarah pulled up moments later, stepping out with a stack of binders under her arm. "You ready?" she asked. "Been ready since the day they called 911 on me." Sheriff Marcus arrived too, leaning against his cruiser with arms crossed. His presence wasn't required, but he showed up anyway, partly to witness, partly to protect, and partly, I think, because he'd been waiting for this reckoning as long as I had. The Army Corps lead, a woman named Inspector Harrington, stepped forward with the kind of posture that said she'd shut down bigger operations than anything Bethany Reed could dream of. She gave me a firm nod. "Mr. Cole, we've reviewed the maps and your documentation. We'll need access to all shoreline areas and any structures connected to the water." "You'll want to start on the HOA side," I said. "They were busy last night." Harrington's eyes sharpened. "We assumed as much." We reached the clearing by the water just as the sun broke over the ridge, and that was when the officials saw it clearly. 3 docks half ripped apart, piles of lumber scattered like bones, tire tracks cutting deep scars across the earth, and broken railings lying crooked in the reeds. Harrington exhaled through her nose, a mix of irritation and grim satisfaction. Destruction of potential evidence, very bold. "Or very desperate," Sarah added. A second inspector took photos rapidly, circling the remains of the largest dock. "These structures weren't just illegal, they violate at least 4 sections of the Rivers and Harbors Act." Harrington nodded. "And that makes them federal offenses." Behind us, the crunch of hurried footsteps echoed. Jake Mercer appeared first, face pale, sweating despite the cold. He was followed by 2 HOA board members who looked like they'd been dragged out of bed and into a nightmare. Hold on," Jake said, hands raised as if he could physically stop the federal process. "You can't just tear apart our community facilities." Harrington didn't even blink. "Mr. Mercer, these facilities were built without permits on a federally designated waterway. They are already in violation." Jake swallowed hard. But we had permission from the HOA." "HOA authority," Sarah said calmly, "does not supersede federal jurisdiction." One of the board members whispered, "Bethany said this was simple. She said we were in the clear." Harrington turned to Jake. "Are you responsible for construction of these structures?" Jake hesitated for half a beat too long. "My company assisted with some improvements, yes." "Improvements," I repeated under my breath. "That's one word for it." The inspector didn't bother hiding her reaction. "Mr. Mercer, you may want to stop talking." The second inspector unrolled a measuring tape, backing into the water as he charted the illegal dock footprint. Another took sediment samples. Another documented oil sheen from jet ski fuel. It was a full-scale investigation, and Jake knew it. This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "We've run summer programs here for years. Kids' lessons, family rentals, we're a positive presence in this community." "The law doesn't make exceptions for positive presences," Harrington said flatly. Behind us, tires crunched again. Bethany Reed emerged from the tree line like a ghost, hair unkempt, clipboard clutched to her chest, eyes wide with a kind of frantic disbelief. She wasn't wearing her usual polished face of authority. She looked smaller, fragile, cornered. "Stop," she said hoarsely. "I demand you stop this. I am the HOA president. You cannot treat Sagewater Lake like it belongs to some outsider." I stepped forward just enough for her to see the paper in my hand. The deed. Clean. Uncontested. Stamped by the county, state, and federal registry. "It doesn't belong to an outsider," I said. "It belongs to the owner, and that's me." Bethany blinked as though she couldn't process English anymore. No, you're lying. That lake has always been ours. It has never been yours," Sarah said gently but firmly. "Not on a single map. Not on a single deed. Not in any legal record." Harrington approached, holding up a laminated federal designation sheet. "And Mrs. Reed, this waterway has been under federal protection since 1889, meaning even if Mr. Cole didn't own the shoreline, your authority would still end at the water's edge." Bethany's breath hitched. Her knees bent like the ground beneath her shifted. No, I built programs here. I organized events. I made this lake valuable. You made it illegal, I corrected. Residents began gathering at the edge of the clearing, drawn by the noise, the trucks, the uniforms. Phones lifted, voices murmured. Someone whispered, "Is this really happening?" Another said, "I trusted her." Bethany looked around wildly, like she'd finally realized the spotlight wasn't adoration this time. It was judgment. A federal agent approached her carefully. "Mrs. Reed, you are hereby notified that the structures built under your directive are in violation of federal code. You will need to step aside while we proceed." "I won't," she whispered, but she already had. The moment the federal trucks pulled in, her authority evaporated like steam off the lake. And then, because justice likes to arrive in full force, another SUV rolled in behind the inspectors. The county prosecutor. He spoke quietly with Marcus, then with Sarah, then with Harrington. Papers were shown, signatures, dates, financial trails. Finally, he stepped toward Jake Mercer. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you're requested for questioning regarding unauthorized commercial activity, falsified permit filings, and potential misuse of HOA." Jake's bravado collapsed in an instant. His face went gray. "This is insane," he whispered. "Bethany told me. She said this would never come back on us." Bethany stared straight ahead, silent now, hands trembling around her clipboard. The prosecutor turned to the residents gathered nearby. "For the record, none of you are under investigation at this time," he announced. "You were misled by individuals who acted without legal authority." A wave of relief washed through the crowd, quickly followed by anger. Real, simmering anger. At Bethany, at Jake, at the lies they'd told and the money they'd taken. Harrington stepped closer to the water's edge, staring over the broken docks like a general surveying a battlefield. "Begin sealing the structures," she ordered. "Document everything." Federal tape went up. Cameras clicked. Boots splashed into shallow water. The lake watched, still and dignified. For the first time since I bought this place, it was being treated with the respect it deserved. I stood quietly, letting the morning wind brush past me, carrying the smell of pine and cold water. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't triumph. This was truth rising to the surface, the same way water always finds level. Justice does too. And today, both had found theirs. But justice doesn't end in a single morning, or with a convoy of federal trucks. It echoes. It settles. It ripples outward until every part of a broken system is forced to look at its own reflection. In the days following the investigation, Sagewater carried an energy I'd never seen before. Something suspended between relief, disbelief, and the raw sting of betrayal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was unraveling. And like all unraveling, it started quietly. Bethany's blue Tahoe remained parked in the exact same spot for 3 days straight. Curtains closed, porch lights off. The woman who once paced the neighborhood with a clipboard and a purpose now seemed to shrink behind the walls of her own home. Even the most loyal HOA members stopped knocking on her door. Jake Mercer disappeared too, his trucks removed from the HOA lot, his crew nowhere in sight. Rumor among residents was that he'd been served a subpoena. Another said his development firm had frozen all operations. Someone else claimed they'd seen him standing outside the county courthouse, hands shaking as he signed documents. People talk in towns like ours, but for once the gossip was backed by paperwork. Meanwhile, the lake, my lake, returned to the version of itself that had convinced me to buy it in the first place. Untouched, unbothered, as if the commotion of the last few months had been nothing more than wind scratching the surface. One morning, I walked the shoreline with a thermos of hot coffee. Frost coated the grass, crunching under my boots. The air smelled like cold pine and new beginnings. And for the first time since moving here, I didn't feel watched. No jet skis, no HOA patrols, no teenagers speeding across the water under Mercer's payroll. Just the lake, just the land, just the quiet that belongs to a rightful owner. Later that afternoon, Sarah and Marcus met me at the community hall. This time, the door hung open, lights flickering inside. The residents had gathered for what was supposed to be a rebuilding meeting. Instead, it turned into something else entirely. People were scattered in small groups, holding papers, pointing at line items, shaking their heads. The financial records that the remaining board members, finally cooperating, had produced were worse than anyone expected. Misused fees, missing revenues, inaccurate ledgers, unauthorized expenditures. Bethany hadn't just overreached. She'd hollowed the HOA out from the inside. Sarah stood at the front of the room, speaking calmly but firmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the best path forward is dissolution. You cannot salvage an organization built on fraudulent foundations." No one argued, not even the people who had once clapped the loudest for Bethany's speeches. A vote was held with a show of hands, rows of palms lifted into the air. The decision was unanimous. Sagewater HOA was officially disbanded. I expected cheering. I expected relief. I expected anger. But instead, what filled the room was something far quieter and far more human: exhaustion. The kind that comes from realizing the thing you trusted had failed you, slowly and thoroughly. An older woman approached me afterward. Grace, I remembered. She had been the one who loved to swim early mornings before jet ski noise took that peace away. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "We never should have let it get this far." "You didn't," I told her. "Your leadership did, and leadership starts at the top." Her eyes misted. She nodded and squeezed my hand. As residents filtered out into the fading light, Marcus lingered near the doorway, his hands hooked in his belt. "You did right by this place," he said. "I did what anyone should have done." He snorted. "Anyone? Remy, 90% of people would have just moved away or sold off the land to avoid the fight." "Maybe," I said, looking toward the lake. "But water doesn't run from pressure. It finds the path it's meant to take." Marcus nodded. He understood, more than most. That evening, I drove back to the cabin. The sun dipped low, casting a gold shimmer across the water. A breeze rolled off the lake, brushing against the old wooden gate at the trail entrance. A gate that had been standing long before Sagewater existed, long before the HOA tried to claim a single inch of this property. I spent the next hour repairing it. Sanding, reattaching the hinges, oil on the metal, a new crossbeam. Then I hung a small wooden sign I carved myself. Private Lake, Federally Protected Waterway, Owner R. Cole. Not aggressive, not threatening, just factual, just steady, just law. When I finished, I stepped back and let the moment settle. This wasn't a victory lap. It wasn't triumph. It was closure. Because the truth about land is simple. It remembers. It carries history. It holds stories. And it knows the difference between people who respect it and people who try to take it. Behind me, the lake rippled gently, calm, untroubled, as if it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. Tomorrow, the federal crew would finish removing the last of the illegal structures. Next week, the prosecutor would finalize charges. Next month, the headlines would fade. But the lake would stay. Quiet, honest, untouched. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, so would I. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning a fight. It's about reminding folks what real ownership and real justice look like. If you've ever had to defend what's yours, Drop a simple yes in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where the truth finally shows up and does its job, I'd be grateful to have you subscribe and stick around for the next one.